Hey everyone. Um, I forgot this. The first line that I have written in my sermon is just, "What a week." um, that's all I'll say about that right now. Uh, but today is the second Sunday of our sermon series where we're focusing on prayer. And I think Chris mentioned this last week, but we're structuring the beginning of this series around a book by Richard Foster that is called Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home. And the book is broken into three sections. The first section is called Moving Inward. The second section is called Moving Upward. And the third is Moving Outward. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the first section today. But first, I want to talk about not praying. Because my suspicion is that as followers of Jesus, we probably don't pray as much as we could. And I'm sure there are exceptions among us, but I am not one of them. Often I have an internal resistance to praying. And so one question I have is why is that? When we can pray and when we should pray, why don't we pray? One reason is that I think that when we're thinking about prayer, or maybe when praying crosses our mind, it can seem more like an obligation than a life-giving practice, let alone an actual real encounter with the living God. And in addition, of course, I'm sure every single one of us feels busy. Our lives are full of distractions. And speaking personally, I seek out the things that distract me from the struggles and difficulties of life. And in the first chapter of the book, Richard Foster says that in a way, he thinks that we are actually intimidated by prayer. And what he means is that we don't think we know how to pray. We assume that we need to get ourselves together before we start praying. And this is a quote of his. He says, "We think that before we can really pray, our lives need some fine-tuning, or we need to know more about how to pray, or we need to study the philosophical questions surrounding prayer, or we need to have a better grasp of the great traditions of prayer," right? And on and on and on. But I think we all know that this is wrong, even if we don't internalize that knowledge. And he continues on and says, this is another quote: "Our problem is that we assume prayer is something to master, the way that we might master algebra or auto mechanics. And that puts us in the top position where we are competent and in control. But when praying, we come underneath, where we calmly and deliberately surrender control, and we become incompetent. Because to pray means to be willing to be naive." And I think another way of saying this is that to pray means being willing to become powerless, or to admit powerlessness. And he writes this in his very first chapter, which he calls Simple Prayer. And he describes simple prayer in this way. In simple prayer, we bring ourselves before God just as we are, warts and all. Like children before a loving parent, we open our hearts and we make our requests. We don't try to sort things out, the good parts of us from the bad parts, or the good intentions from the selfish intentions. We simply and unpretentiously share our concerns, and make our petitions. And so this week, as I was trying to start this sermon, I was sort of forced to try some simple prayer. Because of the events of the week, I was so distracted, so angry, that it seemed impossible, to censor myself during prayer. And then I read this chapter and I was reminded that God is not going to be scandalized by my feelings, no matter how strong they are. So God can handle my anger. God absorbs these things, and if I allow it, God can temper and change these things. And it reminded me of an essay about prayer by a poet. Her name's Mary Carr, and she is a recovering alcoholic. And for most of her life, she was a bitter agnostic. And in this essay, as she's struggling, she really wants to quit drinking. She's tried it over and over again on her own. And someone suggests to her, well, maybe you could try praying for a month, just as an experiment, to see if it would help to help her stop drinking. So she suggests that she tries praying in the morning and then again at night. And even though Mary Carr at the time was full of bitterness and rage, definitely not a fan of God, whatever that meant to her, or even a believer in God, she tries this experiment. But her prayers are not nice prayers or polite or civilized. She says, I prayed with belligerence at least once with a middle finger aimed at the light fixture. And I had to laugh at that because I can relate. And honestly, I have done that. And while praying this week, I will tell you, I said things that you would consider terrible. I said those things to God. I said those things about God, about other people. I articulated my darkest, worst self to God, right? Things that I would be embarrassed for any of you to hear me say. And I think that that is an important kind of prayer. Because prayer essentially is an ongoing relationship with God. And if it's going to be authentic, if it's going to be real, it has to be honest. We cannot hide who we are from God. That's impossible. God already knows who you are. And if we bottle up our wrong or our bad thoughts and feelings or our sinful motivations, we're really just lying to ourselves. And if we can't be honest about who we are, then prayer is not going to change us. So Richard Foster writes that simple prayer, where truthfully we just focus on ourselves. He said that this is the first kind of prayer that people pray. It is the prayer of children. And as we mature, hopefully, as followers of Jesus, we grow into new forms of prayer. But even then, he says, we must return to simple prayer every now and then. And he says that this kind of prayer is actually the most common form of prayer that we see in the Bible. People asking for things, people complaining. It's why I chose that passage from Numbers for our service today, where Moses complains to God, and he basically says, "What are you doing? All of this is actually your fault. You created this people, and now you want me to take responsibility for them." And so we should not feel guilty about simple prayer or selfish prayer. In that same essay that I referenced by Mary Carr, she says that maybe saints turn to God to exalt him from innate righteousness, but the rest of us tend to show up holding out a tin cup. And so I want us to embrace simple prayer, especially if you have had trouble praying recently. Let your requests, that might be a nice word for what you pray, however gross or angry or self-pitying they might be, make those known to God. And this has actually changed how I read many of the angry psalms, where the writer prays for the destruction of their enemies, where the writer at one point even celebrates the murder of his enemies' children. That is human stuff. That is real. The psalmist is praying belligerently and honestly to God. And really, I think what the psalmist is doing is laying it in God's hands, entrusting the ugliness, entrusting the weakness to God, because God absorbs our sin and transforms it. That is what we see in the cross. So I'm not sure if any of you read the email that I sent out today with the Zoom link, but I asked, if possible, if you could all have a pencil or a pen on hand. And I want to do a little experiment here. But I want us to just take a few minutes to do simple prayer. Be as honest with God as possible. If you need to be belligerent, be self-pitying, be selfish if that's what you're experiencing. But the point of this kind of prayer is not to dwell on these feelings or to become obsessed with them. It's to articulate them to God. It's like venting, and then to entrust them to God. So I'm going to set a timer for a couple minutes where we can do some simple prayer, and then I'll gather us back. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or observations? It could be about the sermon or about the exercise, anything that's on your mind, really.
I think it was a really powerful exercise. With my spiritual story, I've had to lean in hard to prayer. I think chronic illness is something that demands prayer, and I think that coming to terms with what you're honestly needing and yielding to God. I think prayer by offering those what you say selfish prayers, but by offering those raw prayers, we can yield to what God wants for us. It's like we can't let go of it until we see we have no control of it. And I think prayer is one of the most important vessels for that. So I really appreciated the message today, but those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciated the message too. I was just saying in house church, I think it was house church or just talking about how I felt like my prayer life is a little bit, I don't know, just not in tip-top shape lately. Been praying not that much for other people, been praying more so for myself. And so it was kind of really reassuring to have the message of like, that's okay. Like that's what the bulk of the Bible is. It's like, oh, when you put it that way, of course it makes sense to be praying for oneself. But I also like that you said the point is not to like dwell or ruminate on the nastiness, but to not avoid it or omit it, lies of omission. So I like that kind of balanced approach of like, get it out there so that God can absorb it and transform it. So those are helpful thoughts for me.
I really appreciated the message too, and the exercise was just felt like a very special few moments. And I think that a lot of times prayer can feel like this is another thing on my to-do list, and just knowing and being able to practice no processing necessary, no kind of filtering anything. I think really turns it into like more of a rejuvenating thing for me, which is really lovely. So thanks.